So, Trump thought the sanctions would break Iran. Khamenei made them break American energy markets instead. Not gradually, not partially, not in the way that economic pressure distributes itself slowly across a complex system until the damage is diffuse enough to be politically manageable. Specifically, structurally, and in the industries that the administration had identified as its domestic political base. The refineries in Texas and Louisiana, the petrochemical processors in Oklahoma, the pipeline operators in Wyoming, the defense fuel contractors in a dozen states whose production lines run on Iranian oil market dynamics that American domestic energy policy cannot replace on any timeline that a refinery manager or a procurement officer or a congressional representative can describe as acceptable. According to sources inside 7 American energy associations with direct knowledge of the supply disruptions their members are managing, the damage is not theoretical, is not projected, is not the kind of speculative forward-looking harm assessment that energy economists produce in the early stages of a sanctions dispute, when the actual impact is not yet materialized in production schedules and delivery delays and quarterly earnings calls. It is operational. It is measured in shuttered refinery capacity, in delivery contracts that cannot be met, in inventory depletion curves whose endpoints arrive faster than the timelines American energy producers had used to calculate their exposure when they modeled the sanctions dispute's impact on their operations. The thing that every model missed, the thing that the administration's own economic advisors had not modeled, that the Congressional Budget Office had not modeled, that the Wall Street research departments that had been producing Iranian sanctions analysis for months had not modeled, was a specific and deliberate manner in which Khamenei's government did not simply allow the sanctions to disrupt the global energy supply chain, but actively engineered the disruption's direction, channeled it, away from Iranian pain and into American operational reality, and did so through a sequence of policy decisions so precisely calibrated to the structure of American energy market dependency that sources familiar with the Iranian strategic planning process described them as having been designed not to win the sanctions war, but to make the sanctions war's cost fall on the side that started it. Warren Buffett, who had been tracking the energy market disruption data from the moment it became visible in energy sector earnings reports, responded to the full picture of what Khamenei had engineered with a statement that sources in energy, finance, and policy circles have been repeating with consistency that attaches to an observation that captures something true about a situation that resisted clear articulation until Buffett provided it. A sanction is a weapon, Buffett said. The question is never whether the weapon wounds. The question is who bleeds from it. Trump pointed the weapon at Iranian oil. Khamenei arranged for American energy consumers to absorb the wound. In 63 years of watching trade policy, I have never seen a sanctions regime redirected with that precision. It is the most elegant energy market reversal I have witnessed. When you understand exactly how Khamenei engineered the redirection, which policy instruments he deployed, in what sequence, targeting which specific nodes of American energy market dependency on global oil flows, and when you hear what the chief procurement officer of a major American refining company said privately to his board in the 3rd month of the disruption, you will understand why sources inside the administration who supported the sanction strategy are now using a word in private that they have not used publicly. The word is miscalculation. Hit subscribe because the energy market story that is unfolding right now in American refining facilities is not the story the sanctions announcement was supposed to produce. And it is getting harder to reverse with every week it continues. Your 401k lost 3% in a single quarter because of the sanctions war. And according to me, it is only going to get more expensive from here. Now, before I continue, I want to quickly mention something that I think every American over 40 needs to see right now. Everything we've been covering, the sanctions, the inflation, the impact on retirement savings, I have compiled all of it into a complete guide called the Buffett Blueprint. It applies Warren Buffett's own investment principles to the specific threat this energy crisis poses to your retirement, your 401k, your Social Security, your fixed income, all covered with a real protection plan you can start this week. The link is right below this video. It is called the Buffett Blueprint. Check it out. Let me give you the full context, because the energy market reversal Khamenei engineered did not happen spontaneously. and the precision with which it targeted American energy consumers rather than Iranian production was not a fortunate accident of economic geography. It was a product of a strategic analysis that Iranian government economists and foreign policy planners had been conducting for months before the sanctions were imposed. An analysis whose central question was not how Iran could minimize the damage of American sanctions on Iranian exports, but how Iran could ensure that the economic pain the sanctions generated fell on the side of the border, where it would produce the fastest, the most politically sensitive, and the most operationally disruptive consequences for the party that had imposed them. The analysis began with a mapping exercise. The Iranian Foreign Ministry, working with an external economic research team whose methodology sources describe as unusually rigorous for a government-commissioned project, produced a detailed map of the American energy sectors with the deepest dependency on global oil market stability, dependencies that were not simply cheaper when sourced from stable markets, but that were either unavailable from American domestic sources at the required specification and volume, or available only at costs and on timelines that would make the affected energy operations uncompetitive relative to their international peers. The mapping exercise identified 47 categories of Iranian market influence that met this criterion. Of those 47, 18 were identified as critical in the specific sense that their disruption would produce operational consequences, not cost increases, not margin compression, but refinery shutdowns and delivery contract failures within a time frame of less than 6 months. Of those 18, 11 were concentrated in energy sectors located in states that the administration's political advisors had identified as essential to the administration's domestic political coalition. This was not a coincidence that the Iranian analysis discovered. It was a structural feature of the global energy integration that had developed over decades of bilateral trade, a feature that the administration's sanctions architects had apparently not mapped with the same precision before imposing the sanctions that would activate it. The Iranian response to the mapping exercise was not to publicize it, not to use it as leverage in public diplomatic communications, and not to threaten its application as a negotiating instrument. The response was to implement it quietly, systematically, and through a set of policy instruments that each had independent justification as legitimate domestic economic policy, while their combined effect was the precise targeting of American energy market dependency that the mapping exercise had identified. The room where the implementation decisions were made was not a negotiating room, and was not a room that appeared on any diplomatic calendar. It was the Iranian government's Domestic Energy Policy Coordination Office, a body whose mandate is the alignment of Iranian industrial, trade, and investment policy, and whose decisions are communicated publicly as domestic economic management rather than bilateral trade strategy. The distinction between domestic economic management and bilateral trade strategy is, in the context of what occurred, less clear than the institutional separation suggests. What the Coordination Office implemented, beginning approximately 6 weeks after the American sanctions were imposed, was a sequence of domestic policy decisions whose combined effect was to redirect Iranian supply, the supply of the 47 critical energy input categories the mapping exercise had identified, away from American market customers and toward the alternative demand frameworks that Iranian bilateral agreements with China, India, Russia, and Turkey had been generating. The redirection was not a ban on Iranian exports to the United States. It was not a counter-sanction, not a market access restriction, not any instrument that could be described under international trade law as a retaliatory measure subject to legal challenge. It was a set of domestic production incentive and logistics support frameworks that made the alternative demand routes more economically attractive to Iranian producers than the American routes. Not by making the American routes more expensive, but by making the alternative routes less expensive, faster, and backed by the kind of long-term demand certainty that the bilateral agreement frameworks provided, and that the American route disrupted by sanctions uncertainty and bilateral political volatility no longer offered at comparable terms. The mechanism was elegant in the specific sense that Buffett identified. It did not fight the sanctions. It used the sanctions. The sanctions had made the American route less economically attractive to Iranian producers by introducing uncertainty and cost into a relationship that had previously been characterized by neither. Khamenei's domestic policy response made the alternative routes more economically attractive by providing the certainty and the cost support that the American route was no longer offering. The Iranian producers who shifted their supply routing were not responding to Iranian government coercion. They were responding to Iranian government incentives. They made a rational commercial decision, routing supply toward committed long-duration demand rather than toward a sanctions disrupted bilateral relationship easier and faster to execute than it would otherwise have been. The first refinery shutdown at an American petrochemical processor occurred in the 8th week of the implementation. It was not announced. It appeared in a supplier communication to an energy procurement department, a quiet operational notification that a delivery schedule was being revised because a critical energy input that had been on order was no longer available at the contracted price and on the contracted timeline, because a supplying producer had reallocated production capacity toward an Asian offtake commitment that offered better economics and longer duration demand certainty. The procurement department escalated the notification. The escalation reached the plant manager. The plant manager's response documented in internal communications that sources describe as having been obtained through channels that cannot be disclosed was 7 words. Find an alternative or we shut down. There was no alternative. The shutdown occurred. It lasted 11 days. The cost and loss reduction and penalty clauses triggered by missed delivery contracts and an emergency sourcing premium that the manufacturer paid to acquire partial substitute supply from a non-Iranian source that could not match the required specification. The total cost of 11 days of shutdown at a single mid-sized American petrochemical facility was documented in an internal assessment that sources describe as running to 23 pages and producing a number that the plant manager described to the facility's owner as the cost of a sanctions policy designed in Washington by people who had never read an energy supplier manifest. It was the first of what became over following 12 weeks 43 documented production disruptions at American energy facilities in 9 states. Disruptions whose individual costs varied from hundreds of thousands of dollars at the smaller facilities to figures at sources familiar with the earnings communications of the largest affected energy companies described as material in a specific accounting sense, large enough to require disclosure, large enough to move analyst estimates, large enough to produce the questions and earnings calls that corporate communications teams had spent the preceding weeks preparing answers for that. Satisfied no one who asked them, the disruptions at the affected energy companies could not resolve through domestic sourcing substitution because the domestic sourcing did not exist at the required specification, volume, or price. The disruptions they could not resolve through import substitution from non-Iranian sources because the global supply of the relevant energy inputs was itself constrained by the same bilateral agreement frameworks that had redirected Iranian supply toward allied demand. The 23-page internal assessment from the first shutdown was circulated through channels that sources describe as informal but effective to government affairs offices of 11 other American energy companies in the same input dependency category. All 11 had read it before their own disruptions began. The 47 critical energy input categories identified by the Iranian mapping exercise represent, in Buffett's assessment, the most precise available inventory of American energy sector vulnerability to Iranian supply disruption ever assembled by any party. And the fact that it was assembled by the party whose supply was being disrupted rather than by the party imposing the disruption is itself the most significant data point about the relative analytical sophistication that the two sides brought to the sanctions war. Washington had sanctions architects. Tehran had supply chain mappers. The supply chain mappers knew more about American energy dependency on global oil market stability than the sanctions architects did. That knowledge is now operational in the form of 43 documented production disruptions in 9 states. And the verdict, which sources describe as a line that has been repeated in energy boardrooms from Houston to Tulsa since Buffett delivered it. Khamenei found the 47 numbers that mattered. He moved them. And he moved them before Washington understood that those were the 47 numbers that determined who wins. Here is what the energy market reversal sets in motion beyond the 43 production disruptions that have already occurred. Because the disruptions that are visible now are not the full extent of what the redirection of Iranian supply produces over the timelines that the alternative demand frameworks commit to. The supply chain consequences compound in a specific direction because the redirection is not temporary, because the Iranian domestic policy incentives that made the alternative routes more attractive than the American route did not expire when the disruptions became visible. And because the bilateral agreement frameworks that provided the alternative demand certainty are measured in decades rather than quarters. Begin with the energy sector consequences, which are the most immediately material and the most politically sensitive. The 43 production disruptions that have occurred are the leading edge of a supply chain adjustment whose full scope will not be visible for 6 to 12 months as the redirected Iranian supply works its way through the production schedules of the full range of American energy companies whose operations depend on the 47 critical input categories. The energy companies that have already experienced disruptions are those with the shortest inventory buffers and the highest input concentration in the specific categories where Iranian supply redirection has been most complete. The energy companies that have not yet experienced disruptions are those with longer inventory buffers, more diversified sourcing, or input dependencies in the categories where Iranian redirection has been partial rather than comprehensive. Their buffers are depleting. Sources inside 3 major American energy associations describe their members' current inventory positions in the affected input categories as averaging approximately 11 weeks of operational coverage. 11 weeks before the disruptions that have already occurred in the leading-edge energy companies arrive with the same operational force at the companies that are currently still running. The second consequence is the domestic investment response. The capital expenditure programs that American energy companies are initiating to develop domestic alternative supply for the inputs whose Iranian availability can no longer be assumed on the terms that American production economics had been built around. The investment programs are real, are funded, and will produce results. On a 3 to 5 year timeline, the gap between the 11-week inventory coverage that current energy companies have and the 3 to 5 year timeline for domestic alternative supply development is 2 years and 41 weeks of operational exposure that no combination of domestic policy response, import substitution from non-Iranian sources, or bilateral negotiation outcome can close on a timeline that the affected energy companies can describe as acceptable to their boards, their customers, or their congressional representatives. The third consequence involves the political geography of the disruptions. The specific fact that 43 production disruptions in 9 states maps onto an electoral geography that sources familiar with the administration's political planning describe as materially overlapping with the states whose energy workers with a primary domestic political constituency, the sanctions strategy was designed to protect and strengthen. The sanctions were imposed to protect American energy production from Iranian market influence. The supply chain reversal Khamenei engineered is producing production shutdowns in American energy facilities in the states whose workers the sanctions were supposed to protect. The political cost of that outcome, the cost of explaining to energy workers in Texas and Oklahoma and Wyoming why the sanction strategy that was supposed to strengthen their position has produced production disruptions in their facilities, is a cost that the administration's political planners had not modeled because the supply chain reversal they were not supposed to model was the outcome of an Iranian strategic response that the administration sanctions architects had not anticipated. The fourth consequence is the one Buffett identified as carrying the most durable weight. The 47 input mapping exercise that produced the energy market reversal is now a permanent feature of the bilateral relationship. It exists. It has been proven operationally effective, and it will be available to every future Iranian government that faces a bilateral sanctions pressure situation with similar characteristics. The permanent knowledge demonstrated through operational execution of exactly which 47 input categories redirect the effective incidence of American sanctions back onto American energy production when Iranian supply policy is aligned to produce that outcome. There is a concept in military strategy that translates precisely into the language of supply chain management, the concept of the center of gravity, defined as a source of strength from which a force derives its power to act and which, if disrupted, causes a force to collapse faster and more completely than any other point of attack could achieve. Every sanctions war has a center of gravity on each side, the specific economic dependencies whose disruption would produce the fastest and most decisive shift in the balance of pain. The administration sanctions architects identified Iranian export revenue as Iran's center of gravity and imposed sanctions designed to disrupt it. What the Iranian mapping exercise revealed, and what Khamenei's domestic policy sequence then operationalized, was that the American energy sector's center of gravity was not its export market or its pricing power or its cost structure. It was its supply chain. Specifically, the 47 input categories where Iranian market influence was irreplaceable on any politically relevant timeline, and where disruption would produce not cost increases, but production shutdowns. The administration attacked Iranian export revenue. Khamenei attacked American supply chains. Export revenue can be rerouted to alternative markets over months. Supply chains cannot be rebuilt in months. The center of gravity Khamenei attacked was more fragile than the one the administration attacked. The disruptions are proving this in 43 facilities in 9 states. In 63 years of watching trade disputes, Buffett said through sources familiar with his final comments on the energy market reversal, "I have learned that the side that wins is not always the side with more power. It is the side that attacks the right target." Trump's sanctions attacked Iranian export revenue. Khamenei's supply chain policy attacked American energy production continuity. Production continuity is not recoverable in the time it takes to reroute export revenue. Khamenei attacked the right target. The 43 shutdowns are the scoreboard. The scoreboard will add entries over the next 11 weeks as the inventory buffers of the second-wave energy companies deplete. The administration is watching it. The affected congressional representatives are watching it. The energy workers whose facilities are in the gap between the redirected Iranian supply and the domestic capacity that will eventually replace it are living it. And the 47 numbers that Khamenei found, the 47 categories that determine who pays the sanctions cost after everyone has responded to the fact that the sanctions exist, are still being redirected. One supply contract at a time away from American production lines and toward the alternative demand frameworks that will still be running long after the sanctions war has become a case study in the cost of attacking the wrong center of gravity.